please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
Very good evening. The Aadhaar hearing in the Supreme Court was an unusual one today. PowerPoint presentations, which are a norm in boardroom meetings, found its way into court number 1, which is the Chief Justice's court, presided by him. The UIDAI Chief Ajay Bhushan Pandey made a PPT presentation to the Constitution bench and highlighted 4 key points. 1, a basic introduction to what is exactly Aadhaar. 2, the technology behind it. 3, the privacy safeguards in place. He also showed a short movie to demonstrate the security measures in place. But what's interesting, during the presentation and the question and answer which followed, he made 3 key concessions. First up, there is no institutional mechanism in place to check the denial of benefits despite authentication. That's the first key concession. The second one being that biometrics cannot be relied upon completely. And finally, here's the third key concession, that there were authentication problems in rural areas on account of bad internet access and electricity issues. To discuss the day's proceedings in detail, I'm joined by senior advocate Kamini Jaiswal, Saket Modi, founder of Lucidius, Amit Malviya, the head of BJP's National IT Cell, and Sanjay Jha of the Congress. Very good evening and welcome to the show, ma'am and gentlemen. First up, Mr. Malviya, I'll come to you. Today was day 2 of the government's defense as far as the Aadhaar regime is concerned. On day 1, we saw the Attorney General point to the safety standards in place by pointing at the height and the width of the walls. And today we have some key concessions coming in from the UIDAI CEO himself. So concessions to the extent where he's agreed. He's pointed out very clearly that biometrics are not 100%, that there are problems in rural areas, and perhaps most importantly, that denial of services, there is no institutional mechanism to check that. So day 2, and given the day 1 and day 2, do you believe that perhaps the government is off to a bad start in this case?
Well, Ashmet, not at all. I'm so amused to see how media narrative quotes everything out of context. Yesterday, when the Attorney General spoke about the height of the wall and the width of the wall, he was responding to the physical security questions raised by those who are opposing Aadhaar, and therefore he was well within his rights to explain what kind of physical infrastructure exists. So let's not quote him out of context and make it look like a silly joke that the Attorney General was making in the Supreme Court, because he wasn't. He was just making a point that was put across. Now, coming to the presentation that the CEO of UIDAI has made today, again, I have seen the presentation that he has made, and he has said that if authentication does not work in every case as a result of technology or otherwise, there are several other mechanisms that are being put in place, like your iris scan, your facial recognition, and so on and so forth. Even an OTP option has been suggested. So if, for example, you cannot do an authentication, you get an OTP, you put the OTP in, the authentication goes. What it essentially means is that the government is absolutely sensitive to the fact that there needs to be multiple technology options available to the people, and the government is doing that. And so is the presentation of the CEO of UIDAI seem to suggest in Supreme Court.
Fair enough. Mr. Malviya, I have to come back to you as far as this issue is concerned. Number one, I was there in the courtroom when the Attorney General made that remark. That was not in response to a probing question where he was merely clarifying as to the security provisions in place. He chose to elaborate on the width of the wall. That's part one. The second, and perhaps more importantly, let's discuss the biometrics. But first, let me draw your attention to the concession that the CEO appears to have made, the UIDAI CEO. The concession is that as of today, there is no institutional mechanism to check. And this was an observation made by the court itself, that authentication problems is one thing, denial of services, denial of benefits is quite another. And when asked and when questioned on whether there's data available, this was a concession coming that as far as denial of benefits is concerned, there is no institutional mechanism available. Doesn't that point to perhaps a big loophole? This has been a key argument of the petitioners against Aadhaar.
Look, the Section 7 of the Aadhaar Act is very clear that no beneficiary will be denied a state support in absence of an Aadhaar. What it also goes on to add further is that the applicant or the beneficiary in this case must be encouraged to enroll in Aadhaar so that he can continue to get financial support from the state through the Consolidated Fund of India. So the law is very clear. If at all there are some exceptions, and which are actually exceptions, then those have to be addressed. It's a matter of awareness. It's a matter of telling people and telling everybody in the administration down to districts and further that Aadhaar or lack of it does not mean that the beneficiary will be denied any benefits. And the Aadhaar Act is very clear.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Fair enough. Mrs. Kamini Jaiswal, if I may come to you, you have been a fierce critic as far as the Aadhaar regime is concerned. Let me bring across these concessions to you. Here we have the UIDAI CEO admitting that as far as the denial of benefits is concerned, there's no institutional mechanism in place. Mr. Malviya has pointed out, has made a reference to Section 7, that in any case, these essential services cannot be denied. Your take on today's court proceedings?
See, let me admit I was not inside.
Mrs. Jaiswal, if I'm audible to you.
Number 2, sections, you know, can you hear me? I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Hello? Yeah. See, there are a lot of provisions in the law, but we have to look at the practical aspect of it. The petitioners have been arguing ad nauseum that there is, you know, number 1, that benefits are being denied to the people. To say that section says it will not be denied is not enough. We have to look at the practical aspect of it. We have to see what is actually happening. You know, and then also the concession by the chairman, CEO today, only confirms what has been argued over the months. Repeatedly this has been argued. And you know, if size of the walls protected was enough security, we wouldn't have to do a lot in this country. We just have to prepare walls around things. That is not enough. We are talking of security in a different sense. Nobody is talking of a security of a wall is not available.
Absolutely.
So therefore, you know, all this argument about, you know, that everybody is trying to just make frivolous out of the statement made by the Attorney General. It's not that. You know, the argument is at a much higher level. It's more on a technical aspect. It's more on the aspect of denial of benefits to the people, and also of so many reports that one has been hearing that actually have been deaths because food has been denied. What has the government done to at least undo that wrong? You can't quote Section 7 to a poor person and say, we have provided Section 7. Now, if it doesn't happen, we can't help it.
Fair enough. Mr. Jha, let me come to you. We were discussing, of course, the concessions that were made today by the CEO of UIDAI. Your thoughts on the government's defense, the way they've mounted it. Day one, we saw the comments coming in from the Attorney General. Today, we have, of course, some key concessions being made by the UIDAI chief, I beg your pardon. Your thoughts, your quick thoughts on how the government's defense stacks up against perhaps the concerns that have been raised by the petitioners.
You know, to just put this discussion in context, I mean, let us remember that Mr. Modi's government went to the Supreme Court actually saying that we Indians don't have our own independent right to privacy until thankfully the Supreme Court overturned that. The more fundamental point has already been raised by, I think, Ms. Jaiswal here, and which is that there are so many instances across the country where people have actually died because they don't have the Aadhaar linking to their food rations. I mean, you know that the midday meal schemes, by the way, have seen a dramatic, lesser number of enrollments because they have insisted on Aadhaar. That's one of the reasons why on the Global Hunger Index, India's ranking has worsened. You have a situation today in the country where Aadhaar, which was meant to be only focusing on those who needed certain welfare subsidies, it has now been expanded into becoming one draconian law, which is why I'm glad the Supreme Court asked, I mean, is this Aadhaar now susceptible to becoming an electronic surveillance system by which government can actually do racial profiling and tracking of individuals' behavior and, you know, their consumption patterns. I think there's a larger worry. And may I add this point, that in the light of the recent hullabaloo that we're hearing about Cambridge Analytica and the breach of data with Facebook, I think one of the biggest worries we have that the Ravi Shankar Prasad as an IT minister in a very irresponsible fashion made a political statement. But what
Mr.
is
Jha, let's keep from digressing here.
Is what about breach of that data? And I'm glad Supreme Court is asking these questions. No,
Fair
the
enough.
Supreme Court asked that question. What about the
Fair
breach
enough.
of data? What does it mean in terms of individual privacy and our right to, you know, kind of have our own, you know, kind of information exclusive to ourselves? So there are larger implications of this, and one of them critically is that this government has to admit that the technology backbone, the entire infrastructure for implementing Aadhaar is today extremely fragile.
Fair enough. Mr. Modi, let me come to you. You're, of course, an expert in matters of cybersecurity. Let me put to you the concessions that were made. There were concerns raised with respect to the biometrics. They're not 100% reliable. Let's caveat that as well. Let's not put that out of context. The UIDAI also clarified that there are other ways and means of verification, of authentication. But there were also concerns with respect to authentication in terms of rural areas where there is no internet access sometimes. There are issues with respect to electricity supply. In response to these concessions, what would your take be? What would your reaction be to perhaps the entire gamut of the infrastructure in place that Mr. Jha was referring to?
So if you really think about authentication and how Aadhaar works out here, let's take a step back and understand that currently what are the ways in which we authenticate anything. Let's start with checkbooks that we sign, which requires physical signatures, till badges that we provide while entering a particular office, till actually going ahead and handing over our PAN card details when we open bank accounts. Now, if you really think about the degree of complexity which is required to go ahead and replicate any of these authenticating mechanisms, it's far, far lower than the degree of going ahead and replicating somebody's fingerprint. So fingerprint, is that foolproof? No, it's definitely not, and it can be replicated. But again, it's as replicable, or I would say much, much complex to replicate than what you would have through the other existing authentication mechanisms to identify individuals. To your question about the infrastructure being fragile, of reaching out to people, I think, as an Indian, I believe one of the best things that I have been able to be fortunately able to see in the last 5 years of my life has been a revolution which has touched 125 crore Indians out of 119 crore Indians, which is the enrollment number for Aadhaar right now, out of a total population of 125 crore population. And think if there was a problem in terms of, onboarding people, because almost 96-97% of the people are now onboarded with Aadhaar. The connectivity or the technology is not a problem. Of course, the other one around how do you get the technology to authenticate through the fingerprint, that is going up as we speak. And scientifically, we are at a point where we are at an accuracy of more than 97 to 98% on certain base models, which cost anywhere between 2,000 to 3,000 rupees, to authenticate somebody.
Mr. Modi, I just have to interject very briefly.
Go ahead, please.
Allow me to just interject that even while we make these concerns with respect to biometrics, number one, he has conceded that it's not 100% accurate, but of course there are other alternate means. I'll raise the same question that Justice Diva Chandrachud raised as a part of today's proceedings, that for people, and this was an observation that was seconded by Justice Sikri as well, the observation being that while this might be true for people who are living in cities, who are living in urban centers, what happens when the same complexity, the same complex mechanism of authentication is applied to somebody who's staying in Jharkhand in perhaps tribal areas or perhaps in more economically backward conditions? That does raise the question, in fact, something as simple as a migrant labor. The question that the Supreme Court raised was that the fingerprints get torn away over a period of time, and hence raising questions over authentication. So these are questions that are being raised. So while it might be true, it might perhaps apply to us, it also applies to people in backward areas.
So there are two different questions that you're asking me. First, what about the complexity of authentication? The second, what about those people whose fingerprints get washed away because of the hard work that they are doing. Let me answer both of them. The first one, in terms of the simplicity of authentication, I do not think there can be a more simple way than giving a 12-digit number and giving your fingerprint. Because I think that's something which, it doesn't matter, you might be in the 5th tier city of the country also, you definitely can do. To your second point, I think it's very, very valid that we have to ensure that there are authentication mechanisms beyond just the fingerprint. And that's the beauty. There are 125 crore people whose not only fingerprints, but their iris plus their photos have also been taken. So I'm of the favor where the current Aadhaar Act needs to be changed, or if not the Act, at least the mechanisms need to change, where if somebody is not being able to authenticate through the biometric, there needs to be a parallel way in which you authenticate somebody, and that's where OTP has been suggested. That's where the pictures have been suggested.
Fair enough. Interesting. So Mr. Modi does back, at least Mr. Modi believes that the infrastructure is simple enough in place to be accessible to large sections of population. Mr. Malviya, let me come to you. And this is with respect to in case where authentication does take place, but services are denied. The Supreme Court made a distinction here that there are cases where perhaps authentication difficulties prompt denial of services, but there are leakages in the system that the Supreme Court observed. And these are cases where authentication does take place, but corrupt agencies disallow access to various amenities, and that this is likely to continue despite Aadhaar. And importantly, I must quote the UIDAI CEO where he said that this is an area where Aadhaar can do little or nothing. And again, stressing on the question that there is no institutional mechanism. Does that perhaps, Mr. Malviya, strengthen the hand of the opposition, strengthen the hand of the petitioners when they say that there is perhaps a sense of exclusion under the Aadhaar regime?
No, I don't understand why that would be the case, because if today a certain beneficiary is being denied something by the agency or people responsible for distribution, at least the Aadhaar ensures that the person who has authenticated is the actual beneficiary. Now, if he's muscled out and he's not given what is due to him, that's a separate matter altogether, and that is something that falls in the realms of law and order and legality and has to be dealt differently. But let's come to the important aspect of what the Aadhaar can do in case some of these agencies turn on. There's obviously an option to credit the individual's account directly. He could be given money in lieu of it, in which he could spend the way he wants to. Why should the state be a nanny and keep telling the individual how much rice and how much gram and how much milk he should have? The individual can decide. The woman of the family can get the allowance from the state, and she can spend it as she wants.
We're digressing, Mr. Malviya. I have to bring you back to this one point alone. I have to bring the conversation back to this one point. You mentioned that it's a case of law and order in case the authentication does take place, and there is still services are denied. But that is the key contention here, that there is no enforcement mechanism. There is no institutional mechanism. The CEO of UIDAI says it's not up to us. Right. The concerned ministry should take it over. That again raises the question. Why one might attribute it to perhaps law and order, if not Aadhaar. But again, the question raised is that there is perhaps an environment of exclusion, Mr. Malviya.
But that exclusion is not because of Aadhaar. And that is the important point to understand. We are discussing Aadhaar. The Aadhaar is not ensuring that exclusion. And there are several ministries which may be providing state benefit to individual. It depends on which beneficiary is seeking what benefit from which ministry. But it in no way is a statement on Aadhaar, and I think that is something that even the courts realize this. Now, coming to what kind of institutional mechanism should there be, that's a separate matter of debate altogether.
But Mr. Malviya, isn't that the same concern here, that Aadhaar, the entire peg, the Attorney General began his arguments yesterday by pointing out that the reason Aadhaar is critical is that it allows people to live a life of dignity through access to food, to education, to shelter. But if the very argument that you tell me as of right now is that Aadhaar system per se may not perhaps deny services, but the neighboring ecosystem is what is prohibiting access, then doesn't that defeat the purpose entirely of providing a life with dignity, with no access?
Ashmit, I also made the point along with it, saying that the government has the option to get into direct cash transfer into the individual's account, in which case there would be no such agencies which are denying benefits to those who must get it. The fact is that Aadhaar and the jam trinity that the government has put in place allows for a great deal of innovation, allows for a great deal of flexibility in terms of how the state is going to support those who need its benefit. And I think that's the future of where we are going to go. A Jan Dhan account, a mobile phone and Aadhaar linked together.
So that's the direction for the future. That's the direction for the future coming in from Mr. Amit Malviya. Mrs. Jaiswal, if I may come to you, the concerns, the argument here being presented by the BJP is that perhaps an alternate model where we have the Jan Dhan Yojana, where we have the direct benefit transfer, that's the answer. In your assessment, does this perhaps is this perhaps another argument in favor of Aadhaar, or does it weaken the Aadhaar argument when we speak of the Aadhaar perhaps in terms of the exclusionary sense, in terms of perhaps benefits being denied?
I'm sorry. If the fact that you would need to go to, what is the purpose of spending all this money on Aadhaar? If ultimately you have to go back to a Jan Dhan Yojana or direct, remission of money, etc. Why do and my concern about Aadhaar is much more serious than even this. My concern about Aadhaar is we are placing all our life in the hands of an agency which has absolutely, there is completely without control. And you know what it could lead to? They could identify people. They could identify people, and the kind of things that happened in the 1984 riots, when with a ration card people were identified and there were violence. This will happen with the Aadhaar, because in whose hand will this go? We don't know. This 15-meter wall may not be able to secure all the data from the hands of an, it is very, very dangerous. Everybody's security and life is in
of the worst kind.
And more in case of where people decide.
I agree. Let's not digress so far away. That's, of course, a question on surveillance. We're confining the discussion this evening as far as exclusion is concerned. Mr. Jha, we're running out of time. I'll come to you for the closing comments here. Indeed, and it will be argued again on Tuesday when the Supreme Court takes up this case for further hearing. But, Mr. Jha, I'll come to you for closing comments. And that, again, the question being raised this evening is the question of exclusion. The question has been one of exclusion. Mr. Malviya is of the clear opinion that Aadhaar does not stand alone. There's, of course, the DBT regime to look at. Mrs. Jaiswal is raising questions that if that's the case, then why spend so much money on Aadhaar in the first place? Mr. Jha, I'll come to you for closing comments. Does this concession by the UIDAI CEO that Aadhaar cannot handle cases where there are perhaps, despite authentication benefits are being denied, does that perhaps contribute further to the argument of the environment of exclusion?
Well, let me tell you, I think it's a very pertinent question. Despite a biometric, by the way, information being there with the agency, there are several cases on account of poor connectivity. You know how, telecom and internet connectivity is still a huge challenge in large parts of a country, particularly in rural areas. And there are people whose biometrics, by the way, are not matching. Let's accept that reality. Biometrics, by the way, are also being fabricated as we talk. So let's not assume that biometric information is necessarily totally insuperable. It is being hacked into. So end of day, if an individual, a poor person who needs a certain welfare benefit, can't even get his biometric verified, can you imagine the trauma they go through? They will not get the food grains or education or scholarship or pension that they need and deserve. And I'll tell you, you raised a very valid point that ultimately the distribution is fundamental. Now, if the person who is actually going to be part of the distribution chain is going to make a short charge there is no way that anybody, even if you have an Aadhaar or anything, it can't really be a substitute for preventing that corruption. And I think the logic that everything should be direct benefits transfer, I think has already been trashed by any sensible analyst, because if you give only money in lieu of goods and other benefits that need to go to the people who need it, it might be abused, it might be misused. There are ways and means by which the entire distribution mechanism on subsidy expenditure works. So I think this is all a very extremely absurd argument being made by the BJP spokesperson here.
Fair enough, Mr. Jha. I believe that's all we have time for. We appreciate the time and perspective that our guests have shared with us, as well as our viewers, Mr. Malviya, Mr. Jha, Mr. Modi, as well as Mrs. Kamini Jaiswal. Appreciate your thoughts and time. Clearly, this is a debate that we've yet to see the end of. What we understand is that the Supreme Court will resume arguments in this case. And mind you, the UIDAI CEO, Mr. Pandey, he's yet to finish his presentation. The PPT presentation will continue once again when the Supreme Court convenes once again, when the Constitutional Bench convenes. That'll be on Tuesday. We'll, of course, bring you all the news and updates. But for now, that's all we have time for. For more news and updates, keep watching CNBC TV18.